The gate had been refusing people for 61,000 years, and Taban Vasic had no reason to believe it would stop for him. He thought about that as he descended, not the kind of thought that moves across the surface of the mind and passes a deeper thing, lodged in the quiet space between his ribs where the harness webbing pressed against his sternum. 61,000 years. The number didn't mean anything to him the way it meant something to the Tessarene scholars who'd been cataloging the site for a decade, running resonance sweeps and spectral analyses, and filing reports in languages he couldn't read. To them it was a data point, a figure attached to geological surveys and isotope readings, and the slow, meticulous business of establishing provenance. To Taban it was something else, a weight, the kind of weight that settles into stone and stays there long after the hands that placed it are gone. He was 53 meters below the surface of Velar-On, a continent-sized basalt shelf on the dark side of a moon that didn't have a name anyone used casually. The Tessarenes called it Dren Voreth, the closed threshold. The Concord's official survey designation was KV 7741b, Subsurface Archaeological Site, Class 8 Restricted Access. The spelunking community, which was small and disreputable and communicated primarily through encrypted message boards and word of mouth in the kind of bars that didn't keep customer records, called it the Vault. Nobody called it what it was. A door that had been sealed shut since before humanity learned to make fire, built by hands that no living species could identify, in a geological formation that should not have contained anything built at all. Taban's headlamp carved a cone of white light through the dark as he worked his way down the final pitch. The rock here was different from the basalt above, smoother, almost polished, the walls of the shaft transitioning from natural fracture patterns to something deliberate. He could feel it through his gloves. The stone wasn't carved. It was shaped, persuaded into geometry by a process that left no tool marks, no drill scars, no evidence of force. The walls were warm to the touch, not heated, not radiating, just warm in a way that basalt at this depth and temperature had no reason to be. He'd felt it before. 3 years ago, when he'd made his first unauthorized descent into the upper chambers and spent 4 hours mapping passage geometry that didn't match any natural formation he'd encountered in 31 years of caving on 7 worlds. The warmth had started at 20 meters. By 40 meters it was unmistakable, a gentle, persistent heat that came from inside the rock itself, as though the stone remembered being alive. That first descent had cost him his survey license. The Concord's Heritage Enforcement Division had tracked his biosignature from the surface sensors the Tessarenes had installed around the site perimeter, matched it to his Spelunking Guild registration, and issued a Class 3 access violation before he'd even climbed back to the surface. The fine had been substantial. The professional consequences had been worse. His guild certification was suspended for 18 months. 3 commercial caving operations he'd contracted with on Frontier Worlds had quietly dropped him from their rosters. His ex-wife Sira, who had left him 4 years earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with caves and everything to do with the fact that he disappeared into them for weeks at a time without explanation, had sent him a message that said only, "You're still doing this." He was still doing this. The shaft opened into a chamber that Taban had seen only on survey feeds, grainy, long-range thermal imaging captured by Tessarene drones that had mapped the void without entering it. The images hadn't prepared him. Nothing could have. The chamber was vast. Not cavern vast, not the cavernous voids he'd navigated in the karst systems of Paulith Major or the lava tubes of Surith Minor. Those were geological accidents, beautiful in their randomness, their ceilings shaped by pressure and heat and the slow patience of water. This was architectural. The walls rose in smooth, curved surfaces that met overhead in a vaulted arch, so perfectly proportioned that it looked weightless, as though the stone had been lifted rather than stacked. The floor was a single unbroken plane of the same warm basalt, polished to a finish that reflected his headlamp in a soft, diffused glow. And at the far end, set into the wall like a wound that had healed wrong, was the gate. It was enormous. 12 meters high, perhaps 8 wide, its surface a single slab of material that was not basalt, not metal, not composite, something that absorbed his headlamp's beam and returned it as a dull, deep luminescence, the way a lake at night holds the moon. The surface was covered in script. Not engraved, not painted, not projected grown. The characters threaded through the material's structure in pathways that caught light and held it, each one a small reservoir of contained radiance. The script had been documented extensively. 3 Tessarine xenolinguistic teams, 2 Palshi mathematical analysis groups, a Keithrani cultural memory delegation, and an 18-month interspecies working group convened by the Concord's Heritage Oversight Bureau had all studied it. High-resolution scans of every character had been distributed to research institutions across 6 worlds. Pattern analyses, frequency mappings, structural comparisons with 14 known ancient scripts, all had been conducted, published, peer-reviewed, and ultimately filed under the heading that the xenolinguistic community reserved for its most honest failures: untranslated, context insufficient. The gate had never opened, not for the Tessarines who had discovered the site, not for the Keithrani custodians who had been assigned to maintain the perimeter seal, not for the Concord engineers who had, in the site's early years, attempted a cautious structural survey of the gate's mechanism. They had found no mechanism. No hinges, no tracks, no pressure points, no seams. The gate was not a door in any functional sense. It was a wall that happened to look like a door, or it was a door that had decided to be a wall. 6 claimants had attempted to open it over the past decade. Tobin had read every report, downloaded every public filing, studied every piece of footage that had been leaked or officially released. The claimants were a varied group. A Tessarine resonance specialist who believed the gate responded to specific harmonic frequencies and had spent 3 weeks broadcasting calibrated tones at its surface before the site administrators revoked her access. A Palshi engineer who had proposed that the gate operated on quantum lock principles and had attempted to destabilize its surface coherence with a directed energy pulse, resulting in equipment failure and a formal reprimand. A human archaeologist who had simply pressed his palms against the surface and stood there for 2 hours, waiting, before being escorted out by heritage enforcement, and 3 Keithrani petitioners who had approached the gate according to ancient custodial protocols, formal address, ritual gestures, spoken invocations in a language that predated their written records, and received nothing. Every attempt had been recorded. Every failure had been documented. The gate's response to all 6 claimants was identical: nothing. No change in surface temperature. No alteration in the script's luminescence. No measurable shift in the resonance field that the monitoring equipment had been tracking since installation. The gate treated every visitor exactly the same way it treated the empty chamber, with the absolute, implacable indifference of something that was waiting for a specific input and had not received it. Tobin stood at the edge of the chamber and looked at it. He was not a scholar. He was not an archaeologist, not a linguist, not an engineer, not a diplomat. He was a spelunker, a man who crawled through holes in rock for a living, who had spent 31 years mapping cave systems on worlds that smelled like sulfur and looked like the insides of broken teeth. His professional qualifications consisted of a guild certification that was currently suspended, a working knowledge of rope systems and anchor placement in unstable geology, and an ability to remain calm in confined spaces that would have sent most people into screaming panic within the first 30 seconds. He had no academic credential that would justify his presence here. No theoretical framework, no research hypothesis, no institutional backing. He had a harness, a headlamp, 200 meters of static rope, a water bottle, and a pair of chalk-dusted gloves that he'd been using since his 30s, because the newer synthetic models didn't give him the tactile feedback he needed to read rock. And he had the sound. It had started 7 years ago, on a routine survey job in the upper cave systems of Drenvoreth's Northern Hemisphere legitimate work, contracted through the Tessarine's own Geological Survey Division, mapping natural passages that ran parallel to the archaeological site, but were classified as geologically distinct. Tobin had been 30 meters down a narrow phreatic tube, his body wedged between walls that pressed against his shoulders and his back simultaneously, inching forward through dark that was absolute in a way that surface dwellers never experienced when he'd heard it. Not with his ears. That was the part he could never explain to anyone who hadn't been there, the part that made people look at him the way Sira had looked at him in the months before she left, with a careful, evaluating patience that was already calculating the distance to the nearest exit. The sound didn't enter through his ear canals. It entered through the rock, through his palms pressed flat against the tunnel walls, through his knees, his forearms, the side of his face where it rested against the stone while he breathed and assessed the passage ahead. A hum. Low, continuous, complex in a way that didn't resolve into a single frequency but layered, harmonics folding over harmonics like voices in a choir that sang in a register below human hearing. It moved through the stone the way heat moves through metal, conducted, carried, transmitted along pathways that the rock itself seemed to provide. And it was not random. It pulsed, slowly, steadily, with a cadence that Tobin's body recognized before his mind could name it. It matched his heartbeat. Not exactly, not a mirror, but a response the way a conversation partner matches breathing without thinking about it, the way two people walking together fall into step. The hum felt his pulse and adjusted. When his heart rate climbed, stress, exertion, the claustrophobic pressure of the tube, the hum shifted with it, maintaining the relationship. When he paused and breathed and his pulse settled, the hum settled with it. He had told no one, not his crew chief, not the Tessarine site coordinator, not the Geological Survey office that had contracted the job. He'd finished the mapping assignment, filed his report, collected his payment, and spent the next 3 years trying to forget what he'd felt. He couldn't forget. The hum was there every time he went underground. Not on every world, only on Drenvoreth, only in passages that ran below a certain depth, only in rock that had the same warm, persuaded quality he'd felt in the upper chambers. It grew stronger as he descended. It grew more articulate, more structured, more intentional. By the second year he could distinguish individual patterns within it, repeating sequences that functioned like phrases, variations that built on earlier patterns, responses that seemed to track not just his heartbeat but his movement, his breathing, his direction of travel. By the third year he knew what it was. Not intellectually, he didn't have the vocabulary for intellectual certainty about xenoarchaeological phenomena. Viscerally. In the place where the harness pressed against his chest and the rock pressed against his hands and the dark pressed against everything, the hum was the gate. The gate was calling him. Not a broadcast, not an alarm, not a beacon sweeping the void for any receiver. A directed signal, aimed at one body, traveling through 61,000 years of patient stone to find him. The knowledge had dismantled his life with the efficient thoroughness of a disease. He'd stopped taking commercial contracts. He'd burned through his savings funding private expeditions to Drenvoreth, 8 separate trips over 4 years, each one pushing deeper, each one bringing him closer to the source of the hum. The first unauthorized descent had taken him to 35 meters. The hum at that depth had been rudimentary, a single sustained tone, barely distinguishable from geological settling, easy to dismiss as imagination. He'd mapped 2 branching passages and found the first shaped stone, a section of wall where the natural basalt transitioned over a span of perhaps 3 meters, into the same polished, warm, toolmark-free surface he would come to know so well. The transition was seamless. No joint, no seam, no boundary visible to the eye. The rock simply stopped being random and started being deliberate, the way a riverbed stops being gravel and starts being clay gradually, inevitably, as though the stone itself had decided to become something else. The second descent, 4 months later, had taken him to 41 meters. The hum at that depth was unmistakable, a layered chord that resonated in his wrists and the long bones of his forearms. He'd found a second transition zone, and a third, and realized that the shaped stone wasn't a local anomaly. It was a network. The passages he'd been mapping as natural geological features were threaded through with sections of shaped basalt, each section warmer than the surrounding rock, each one carrying the hum with a clarity that the natural stone dampened. The shaped sections were conduits. The hum traveled through them, the way electricity travels through copper preferentially, efficiently, with minimal loss. By the fifth descent he was at 47 meters, and the hum had become conversational. Not words, he never heard words until the gate chamber. But responses. He would place his palm on a section of shaped wall and the hum would shift not randomly, not in reaction to temperature or pressure, but in recognition. The same way the hum tracked his heartbeat, it tracked his touch. Where he placed his hand mattered. The hum responded differently to contact at different points, as though the wall were a surface with designated inputs, and his palm was the activation mechanism. He'd been arrested on the sixth descent. The heritage enforcement team had been polite, professional, and unmoved by his explanation that the rock was talking to him. The lead officer, a Tessarene woman with the measured patience of someone who had processed too many trespassers in archaeological zones, had listened to his account, noted it in her report, and recommended a psychological evaluation as part of his processing. The evaluation had come back clean. Tobin was not delusional, not schizophrenic, not suffering from any diagnosable perceptual disorder. He was, in the evaluator's carefully worded summary, a high-functioning individual with an unusual proprioceptive sensitivity to subsurface geological phenomena, presenting within normal parameters. The evaluator had not gone underground. If she had pressed her palms against the shaped stone at 47 meters and felt the hum answer her touch, the summary might have read differently. Or it might not have. Tobin had come to understand that the hum was specific. It was not broadcasting to everyone. It was talking to him. He'd been arrested again on the 7th descent and fined on the 8th. The Heritage Oversight Bureau had formally warned him that further unauthorized access would result in criminal prosecution and permanent revocation of his spelunking credentials across all conquered-administered worlds. The warning had come with a document he was required to sign acknowledging that he understood the consequences. He'd signed it, then he'd come back. Because the gate was calling and he was the only one who could hear it, and if he didn't answer, no one would. Now he stood in the chamber, 53 meters below a moon that most of the galaxy had forgotten, and looked at the thing that had been waiting for him. The script was brighter than the survey images had shown. The characters pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm that Tobin recognized instantly, the same cadence as the hum, the same heartbeat-matched pulse that had followed him through 3 years of increasingly reckless descents. They were not static, they moved. Not physically, not shifting across the gate's surface, but luminously, the light inside each character cycling through intensities in a pattern that rippled outward from a point near the gate's center, like breath, like the expansion and contraction of lungs made of light and stone. His headlamp was unnecessary here. The gate provided its own illumination, a deep, warm amber that filled the chamber with a light that had no source and cast no shadow. The same amber as the hum, if a sound could have a color. The same warmth as the stone under his hands. Tobin unclipped his harness from the descent line. He set his pack against the chamber wall, removed his headlamp, placed it on top of the pack. He stood in the gate's light in his base layers, a thin thermal shirt, climbing trousers worn soft at the knees, the chalk-dusted gloves that Sierra had once threatened to throw away because they shed white dust on every surface in the apartment. He walked toward the gate. The script responded. He was 30 meters away when the first characters shifted the ones nearest the gate's center, the ones whose pulse had been steady and slow since he'd entered the chamber. They brightened. Not dramatically, not the aggressive flare of a system powering up. A recognition. The way a candle flame leans toward a draft, the way a flower turns toward light. The characters nearest the center brightened, and the ones adjacent to them brightened a moment later, and the effect rippled outward across the gate's surface in concentric waves that followed the pace of his footsteps. At 20 meters, the hum changed. He'd been hearing it since the chamber, the same deep, layered, heartbeat-matched vibration that had haunted him for 7 years. But now it shifted. The harmonics separated, resolved, clarified, as though the hum had been a compressed signal all along, and proximity was the decompression algorithm. Individual frequencies emerged from the layered wash. Low tones that resonated in his chest, mid-range tones that he felt in his jaw and the bones behind his ears. High tones so delicate they registered as temperature rather than sound, a warmth on his skin that pulsed with the rhythm of the rest. At 10 meters, the gate spoke. Not in words, not yet, in structure. The script on its surface reorganized characters sliding along their threaded pathways, reforming into configurations that Tobin could not read but could feel. The patterns had weight. They settled against his perception the way a hand settles on a shoulder, present, deliberate, communicative in a way that preceded language. The gate was telling him something in the only vocabulary it had available before it knew whether he had words. He stopped at 5 meters, the same distance where Dale Corrin had stopped before a different relic on a different world, the same instinct, not fear, recognition that the last 5 meters were not his to cross uninvited. The gate surface changed. A seam appeared, not a crack, precise, deliberate, running vertically from the top of the gate to the bottom in a line so straight it looked drawn. The seam widened. Light poured from inside it, not amber, not warm. White. Clean, absolute white, the white of a sun seen through atmosphere, the white that contains every other color and gives none of them precedence. Through the widening seam, Tobin saw something impossible. A passage. Not a corridor, not a tunnel, a passage in the way that a river is a passage, something that flowed and moved and carried. The walls were the same warm stone as the chamber, but they were alive with script, every surface covered, every character lit, the entire passage thrumming with a luminescence so dense and so structured that it looked like language made visible, like someone had found a way to carve thought into stone and light it from within. The passage descended, steeply, curving, disappearing into depth that his eyes couldn't follow. And from the depth, the hum rose, not the compressed signal he'd been hearing for 7 years, but the full, unfolded voice of whatever was down there. A sound so complex and so vast that it filled the chamber and the passage and the space inside his chest with a single, sustained, impossible chord. Tobin stood at the gate's edge and breathed. He could see, carved into the stone at the passage's entrance, a single line of script that was different from the rest, larger, simpler. The characters were broader, less ornate, spaced with the deliberate care of a sentence that had been written to be read first before all others. He couldn't read it. He didn't speak whatever language this was. But the hum carried it to him anyway, not as translation, not as words he could parse and repeat, but as meaning. Direct, unmediated, pressed into the bones of his hands and the wall of his chest like a palm print in wet clay. The line said, "State your purpose. You have been heard, now speak." The gate had opened for him. The gate that had refused 6 formal claimants, 3 ancient custodial rituals, a harmonic resonance specialist, a quantum engineering proposal, and 11,000 years of patient Keith-Ronnie vigilance had opened for a spelunker with chalk on his gloves and a suspended license, and an ex-wife who thought he was delusional. And it was asking him to explain why. He almost laughed. The sound caught in his throat, not bitter, not cynical, helpless. The most profound artifact in the known galaxy, had just opened a door that had been sealed since before his species existed, and its first request was an interview question. Tobin pressed his palms flat against the passage's entrance walls. The stone was warm under his hands. The hum flowed through his fingers, up his arms, into his chest, and settled there like a second heartbeat beside his own. "I came because you called," he said. His voice sounded thin in the chamber, a human voice in a space built for something older and larger and more patient than humanity. "I heard you, through the rock, through 3 years of descents that cost me everything I had. You matched my heartbeat and I followed it down." The script on the passage walls flickered. Not in response to his words, in response to the vibration of his voice conducted through the stone under his palms. The gate was reading him, not his language, his frequency. The specific, unique, unrepeatable pattern of vibrations that Tobin Vasek's body produced when it spoke. The hum shifted again. A single harmonic separated from the chord clearer than any before, almost tonal, almost a voice. It rose from the passage's depth and passed through the stone and through his hands and formed in the space behind his sternum, a shape that was not a word but felt like one. "Continue." Tobin closed his eyes. The amber light of the chamber painted the inside of his eyelids warm. "I don't have credentials. I don't have a theory. I don't have a framework or a hypothesis or a research proposal. I'm a man who crawls through holes in rock for a living, and I've spent the last 7 years following a sound that nobody else can hear to a place that everybody else says I shouldn't be." He paused, the hum waited. "But I know what you are. Not what you contain, I don't know that. Not what you were built for or who built you or why. I know what you are the way I know what a cave is. Not from studying it, from being inside it. You're a passage. The gate isn't a door, it's a throat. You're a passage that goes down into something, and whatever is down there has been waiting, and the waiting is the whole point. The waiting is the function. You were built to wait, and now you're done waiting, and you opened because I'm the one you were waiting for." The hum shifted. Another harmonic emerged, questioning, evaluative, like a hand turning an object to examine it from a new angle. The transmitted shape pressed against his sternum was precise. "Show." "Show what?" The vibration clarified, not show as in demonstrate, show as in reveal, open. The gate wanted him to drop something, a wall, a pretense, a held-back truth. It was not satisfied with his explanation. It wanted the thing beneath the explanation. The thing he hadn't said because he hadn't known how. Tobin exhaled. The amber light pulsed with his breath. "I hear things other people don't hear," he said. "Not voices, not messages, structures. The way a cave breathes, the way weight distributes through a ceiling, the way a fault line talks before it slips. I've been doing it since I was 22 years old. My first crew chief called it instinct. My second crew chief called it a gift. Sierra called it the reason I'd rather be underground than anywhere else, including with her." He swallowed. His voice was rougher now, the words pulled from a place he didn't visit in conversation. "The scholars who came here, the good ones, the ones with decades of training and equipment worth more than every contract I've ever worked, they studied your surface. They scanned it. They photographed it. They ran algorithms and built models and wrote papers. And none of them heard you, not because they weren't smart enough. Because they were studying you from the outside. They were looking at you the way you look at a painting from across the room, with their hands behind their backs. I've never done anything from across the room in my life. I do things by pressing my face against them and my hands into them and my body through them. That's not a method. That's just who I am." The hum listened. The gate listened. The stone under his palms listened with the full attention of a system that had been calibrated to detect exactly this, not credentials, not theories, not institutional authority, but the specific vibration of a body that had spent a lifetime learning to receive what stone had to say. The words came out plain, unpolished. The vocabulary of a man who had never given a presentation to an academic committee, or written a research abstract, or spoken to anyone about this in language more sophisticated than what he'd used in bars with other spelunkers, trying to describe a feeling he couldn't name, watching their expressions shift from interest to concern to the careful neutrality that meant they were wondering whether he'd been underground too long. The hum's response was immediate. The single harmonic he'd felt, the almost voice, the shaped vibration swelled. It deepened. It branched. What had been one frequency became 5, became 12, became a lattice of interlocking tones that filled the chamber and the passage and the stone and his body with a sound that was not music and not speech, but something that contained both and preceded both, the way bedrock contains and precedes the rivers that eventually carve through it. The script on the passage walls ignited. Not brightened, ignited. Every character on every surface blazed with a white amber light so intense that Tobin's vision washed out and reformed, his eyes adjusting to an illumination level that was not painful but was absolute, leaving no shadow anywhere in the chamber, no gradient, no darkness. The passage was fully lit from entrance to its deepest visible point. And the light moved not randomly, not decoratively, but in waves that traveled downward along the passage's curve, each wave carrying a new configuration of characters, a new sentence in the language he couldn't read but could feel. The walls under his palms vibrated with transmitted meaning. The gate was talking. The gate was talking fast, pouring information through the stone the way a river pours through a broken dam, not a trickle, not a measured flow, but a release, decades of pressure finding an outlet. He couldn't decode it. He wasn't a translator, not a linguist, not a pattern recognition algorithm running on military-grade hardware. He was a pair of hands on warm stone and a chest full of sound. But he could feel the shape of what the gate was saying, the way you can feel the shape of a conversation in a language you don't speak, the rise and fall, the emphasis, the rhythm. It was structured. It was sequential. It was presenting something in order, building from simple to complex, each new layer resting on the one before it. It was teaching him. Not teaching him the language that would take years if it was possible at all. Teaching him the shape, the structure, the architecture of what lay below. The passage was not a corridor. It was a curriculum. Every meter of descent was a lesson. Every line of script a page in a manual that had been written for a reader who would approach it not through the eyes, but through the hands, through the body, through the specific resonant frequency of a living being pressed against living stone. The gate had been sealed for 61,000 years because the student hadn't arrived. Now the student was here, and the school was open, and the first lesson was this. The passage goes down, and the going is the learning, and the learning is the proof of readiness. Tobin opened his eyes. The passage stretched below him, curving gently, every surface alive with light and language. The hum had settled into a steady, complex rhythm that matched his breathing, not his heartbeat now, but his breathing, as though the gate had moved from tracking his involuntary systems to his voluntary ones, following his conscious choices rather than his autonomic functions. He took his hands off the walls. The hum continued. The light held. The gate had not been dependent on his touch, it had been waiting for his touch, and now that it had confirmed what it needed to confirm, it would stay open whether his palms were on the stone or not. He stepped into the passage. The stone under his feet was warm. The script on the walls rippled as he moved, characters brightening ahead of him and settling behind, tracking his progress like a cursor on a page. The passage was wide enough for two people side by side, tall enough that he didn't need to duck, angled steeply enough that he placed each foot carefully, feeling for the subtle texture changes in the polished stone that told him where the footing was secure. 30 meters in, the passage opened into a second chamber. This one was smaller than the first, perhaps 20 meters across, roughly circular, the vaulted ceiling lower. The walls were covered in the same living script, but the pattern was different here. The characters were grouped into clusters, each cluster separated by smooth bands of unscripted stone, each band exactly the same width. It looked like text on a page, paragraphs, or sections, or entries in a record. In the center of the chamber, set into a raised platform of the same warm basalt, was a second artifact. It was not a gate. It was a well, a circular opening in the stone, perhaps 2 meters across, its rim carved with characters larger and more ornate than any he'd seen, the kind of script that marked beginnings, the kind of letters you carved when you were writing something that would be read first and remembered last. The well descended into the stone below the chamber's floor, and from its depth, from whatever lay at its bottom or beyond its bottom, the hum rose in its fullest, most articulated, most unmistakable form. The sound was a voice. Not a human voice, not any voice he could have identified or imitated, but a voice in the way that matters, intentional, directed, shaped by consciousness rather than mechanism. It rose from the well in spiraling harmonics that climbed the chamber's walls and lit the script as they passed, each harmonic igniting a different cluster of characters, each cluster blazing briefly and then settling to a steady glow, like words being spoken aloud for the first time in 61 millennia. Tobin approached the well. The rim's script brightened at his proximity, the same recognition response the gate had shown, but stronger, more immediate. The characters didn't just brighten. They moved. They reorganized. They shifted along their carved pathways and reformed into a new configuration. And the new configuration pulsed with a rhythm that matched his breathing so precisely that for one disorienting moment he couldn't tell whether he was breathing at his own pace or at the well's. He placed his hands on the rim. The stone was not warm. It was hot, not painfully but unmistakably, the heat of a living system in full operation, the heat of something that had been dormant and was now awake and working. The hum traveled through his palms and up his arms and into his chest, and this time it didn't settle. It kept moving. Into his throat, his jaw, the plates of his skull, the spaces behind his eyes. It filled him, not invasively, not painfully. The way water fills a vessel naturally, following the shape of what receives it, occupying every available space without forcing any of them. The voice from the well spoke. Not in his language, not in any language. In the same transmitted meaning he'd felt at the gate, direct, pre-linguistic, pressed into the architecture of his body by vibration. But clearer now, more articulate, more precise. What had been shapes at the gate were sentences at the well, and the sentences carried information so specific that Tobin's mind formed images without deciding to. Structures, deep below, carved into the planet's mantle with the same impossible precision as the chambers above. A network. Passages branching from passages, chambers opening into chambers, each one containing something, not treasures, not weapons, not the cargo of a dead civilization stripped of meaning. Records. Living records held in stone and light and vibration, maintained by the same system that had maintained the gate for 61,000 years. A library carved into the bones of a world, sealed and maintained and waiting, its shelves made of stone and its books made of sound and its catalog written in a language that could only be read by a body pressed against it. The images continued. They came in layers, each one building on the last, each one more detailed than his mind could comfortably hold. First, the library's gross structure. A central well, the one under his hands, descending through kilometers of shaped stone, branching passages radiating outward at each level like the spokes of a wheel, each spoke terminating in a chamber, each chamber containing walls of encoded script. Not dozens of chambers, hundreds, possibly thousands. The network extended deeper into the moon's interior than any geological survey had imagined, far below the depths that the Tessarine drones had mapped with their thermal imaging. The survey had found the gate chamber and the upper void, and declared the subsurface structure fully catalogued. They had catalogued the lobby. Second, the record sets. Each branch contained a different category of preserved information, and the categories were not arbitrary. They were chronological. The uppermost branches, the ones closest to the surface, closest to the gate, held the oldest records. The deepest branches held the most recent. And most recent still meant older than any living civilization's recorded history, older than the Keithrani's ancestral memory, older than the Tessarine's mathematical archives. The library's most recent entry predated the conquered of free peoples by a margin so vast that the conquered was, by comparison, an infant organization making its first uncertain sounds. Third, the content, not treasure, not weapon schematics, not the military archives or resource catalogs that dead civilizations usually left behind, the kind of thing that made heritage enforcement nervous and arms dealers attentive. The records were observations, surveys. Detailed, meticulous, calibrated observations of developing species across hundreds of star systems, recorded over a span of time so enormous that Tobin's mind couldn't hold the number, and settled instead for the feeling of it deep, patient, geological. The builders had been watchers, not conquerors, not traders, not colonizers. Watchers who had devoted their civilization's resources to observing the development of life across a section of the galaxy, recording what they found with the same precision they'd used to carve these chambers, and sealing it all here, in a library tuned to the resonant frequency of one particular species they had found developing on one particular world in one particular arm of one particular galaxy. Earth, the records included Earth. Not as a footnote, not as one entry among thousands, as the central reference point, the calibration standard, the species whose physical characteristics had been used to tune the library's interface: bone density, vocal cord resonance, cardiopulmonary rhythm, was the species the builders had been watching most carefully, the one they had built their entire archive around. Fourth, the question, the library's encoded purpose, the reason for its existence, the answer to why 61,000 years of sealed patience was worth the cost. The builders had found something in their observations, a pattern, a potential, a trajectory that they considered significant enough to justify preserving their entire archive in a form that only the observed species could access. They had not wanted the Tessarines to read it. They had not wanted the Keithrani or the Palshi or the Vashiri or any other spacefaring civilization to find it and interpret it and filter it through their own frameworks. They had wanted the subjects of the observation to read it themselves directly, without intermediaries. What the builders had seen in humanity, what had made them build this place and seal it and wait, Tobin could not yet grasp. The transmitted meaning blurred at that edge, like a landscape seen through rain. The information was there, encoded in the well's harmonics, waiting in the deeper chambers. But it was layered behind the interface's progression logic. You had to go deeper to access it. You had to descend through the passage and press your hands against wall after wall, chamber after chamber, learning the library's vocabulary one handhold at a time. The script wasn't a language in any sense the Tessarines understood. It was an interface, a surface, like the face of a cliff, that you couldn't read from a distance but could feel with your hands once you were pressed against it. The library had been built for hands, for bodies, for the specific resonant frequency of a living being whose pulse and breath and bone structure matched the calibration parameters that the builders had encoded into every wall, every passage, every character. The library was biological, not alive, not organic in the way that cells are organic. Tuned to a specification that no Tessarine body could meet, no Palshi mind could match, no Keithrani ritual could satisfy. Tuned to a human. The realization arrived without drama. It settled into him the way the hum had settled naturally, following the shape of what he already knew. The warmth in the stone, the heartbeat matching, the way the gate had tracked his pulse and then his breathing, moving from involuntary to voluntary, from reflex to choice. The library hadn't been waiting for a scholar or a diplomat or a chosen heir or a lost bloodline. It had been waiting for a body, a human body. any human body with the physical resonant characteristics that the builders had specified 61,000 years ago, long before any human had set foot on any world but Earth. Tobin's hands tightened on the rim of the well. Someone had built this place for humans. Not for humanity as an abstract concept, not for the idea of humans, but for the specific, measurable, physical characteristics of the human body: bone density, vocal cord resonance, cardiopulmonary rhythm, the particular way human hands transmitted vibration through contact with stone. Someone had encoded those specifications into an architectural masterwork carved into the mantle of a dead moon on the far side of the galaxy, 61 millennia before the Tessarines discovered it, 93 millennia before the first human off-world colony was founded. The implications unfolded in his chest like a map opening. He could feel the well feeding them to him, not forcefully, not urgently, but with the steady patience of a teacher who knows the student needs time between lessons. The Tessarines had been the first spacefaring civilization to reach Dren Vorath. They had cataloged the site, established the monitoring perimeter, installed the resonance sensors, and studied the gate for a decade. Their scholars were brilliant. Their xenolinguistic tradition was the oldest and most sophisticated in the conquered. They had come to this place with humility and rigor, and the full weight of a civilization that had been decoding ancient scripts for longer than humanity had been writing them. And the stone had ignored them, not rejected them. The gate didn't reject, it simply did not recognize. The Tessarine body was not the body it had been built to receive. The Tessarine vocal cord structure was not the structure it was calibrated to detect. The Tessarine heartbeat was not the heartbeat it was waiting to match. The stone had felt their presence the way a lock feels the wrong key registering contact without engaging. The same for the Palshi, whose mathematical precision was the envy of every research institution in the conquered. The same for the Keithrani, whose cultural memory extended further back than any other living species, and whose custodial traditions carried the weight of millennia. The same for every species, every scholar, every claimant who had stood before the gate and waited for a response. The response had always been reserved, held in escrow. 61,000 years of patient stone, waiting for the one species whose body could complete the circuit. And that species, his species, had arrived in the conquered as the youngest, the least experienced, the ones who contributed brute force computational enthusiasm, and were treated with the fond, distant tolerance that senior colleagues extend to promising interns. Humanity had not earned its place in the galaxy through ancient tradition or mathematical elegance or cultural memory. It had earned it by showing up, by being stubborn, by crawling through holes in rock on frontier worlds, because someone had to map them and humans were willing to do the crawling. The builders had known that about humans too. They had calibrated their library not for the most intellectually sophisticated species they could find, not for the most culturally refined or the most technologically advanced. They had calibrated it for the species that would come and press its hands against the stone and listen, the species that would crawl. Someone had known what humans were and what humans would become, and had built them a library and sealed it and waited. The voice from the well shifted. The harmonics resolved further, tighter, cleaner, more deliberately shaped. The transmitted meaning sharpened from images to something closer to language, as though the system was learning him as he was learning it, calibrating its output to his specific neural architecture, adjusting its vocabulary of vibration to match the vocabulary of his perception. And then it spoke the words. Not transmitted meaning, not shaped vibration, not prelinguistic pressure against the inside of his skull. Words. Spoken words in a voice that was not human but had learned enough about human vocal production in the last 90 seconds of contact to approximate it. A voice made of stone and harmonic resonance and 61,000 years of patient waiting, speaking for the first time to the body it had been built to speak to. First voice of the living stone. The words filled the chamber the way the light filled the passage completely, leaving no space unfilled. They were not loud. They were not commanding. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of a system that had just completed a verification process that had taken 61 millennia and found the result it was looking for. Tobin's legs gave. He went to his knees on the chamber floor, his hands still on the well's rim, his forehead dropping to rest against the warm stone. The hum surrounded him above, below, on every side, conducted through the floor and the walls and the rim and the air itself. A full-body embrace of sound that matched his breathing and his heartbeat, and the rhythm of the tears that ran down his face and fell onto the basalt. He was not crying from grief, not from joy, from recognition. The same recognition the gate had shown him, the acknowledgement that something long waited for had finally arrived, that a circuit left open for 61,000 years had finally closed, and the closing was not an event but a homecoming, the completion of a journey that had started before the traveler was born. "First voice of the living stone," the well repeated, and this time the words were accompanied by meaning, the full, uncompressed, articulated meaning that the hum had been carrying in fragments for 7 years. Voice, the one who speaks, the one whose body can produce the vibrations that the library's interface requires, not just any voice, the first human to press hands against the stone and hear the response, the first human to descend through the passage and arrive at the well and place palms on the rim and receive the library's address. Living stone, the library itself, the network of passages and chambers and encoded records that the builders had carved into this moon's interior. Living not because it was organic but because it was active, maintained, powered, cycling through its 61,000-year monitoring routine, refreshing its calibration parameters, testing the resonance field, waiting for the specific body that would activate the interface. The stone was alive in the way a beacon is alive, broadcasting, patient, purposeful. The builders had known that humans would come, not when the calibration parameters were not predictive in that sense. They had encoded the physical specifications and activated the monitoring system and sealed the gate and left. They had trusted the math. They had trusted that a species matching those specifications would eventually evolve, eventually reach this moon, eventually produce an individual who would descend far enough and listen carefully enough and press hands against stone with enough patience and enough loneliness and enough stubborn, irrational, career-destroying devotion to hear what the stone was saying. Tobin raised his head from the rim. The chamber around him was fully alive now, every character on every wall lit and pulsing, the script cycling through configurations he could feel but not decode, the hum resonating through every surface in a sustained chord that held more information than he could process in a lifetime of listening. The well beneath his hands hummed with a deeper note, a basso profundo vibration that he felt in his pelvis and his spine, the kind of sound that large structures make when they are resonating at their fundamental frequency. The library was waking up, not just this chamber, the entire network. He could feel it through the stone, the way you can feel a building system's coming online when you're standing in its basement with your hand on a support column. Passages he hadn't walked were lighting up. Chambers he hadn't entered were activating. The monitoring system that had been running its patient 61,000-year scan was shifting into a new mode, reception mode, awake mode, the mode it had been built for. He stood slowly. His knees ached from the stone floor. His hands were stiff from gripping the rim. His face was wet, and his chest was full of a sound that was not his heartbeat but felt as essential, and his mind was trying to hold an understanding that was too large for any single thought. He was the first human to hear the library, the first to answer its call, the first to press hands against 61,000-year-old stone and have the stone press back. The designation first voice was not a title of authority. It was a title of chronology. He was first because someone had to be first, and the library had found him because he had spent 7 years listening to rock and following vibrations into depths that no reasonable person would have entered. The passage behind him remained open. The gate at the surface remained open. The light in both held steady, the script cycling, the hum sustaining. Nothing was closing. Nothing was urgently demanding. The library had waited 61 millennia. It could wait for him to catch his breath. Tobin looked down into the well. The light from below was white amber, steady, depthless. He couldn't see the bottom. He didn't know if there was a bottom. The hum rising from it carried the shapes of more chambers, more passages, more records than his mind could map, a civilization's entire preserved memory, encoded in stone and vibration, waiting for hands to read it. His hands. He thought about Sira, about the message she'd sent, "You're still doing this," and the way her voice would sound if she could see him now, kneeling in a chamber beneath a dead moon with tears on his face and a 61,000-year-old library calling him by a name he hadn't known he had. She would think he'd finally lost it completely. She might be right. The line between revelation and delusion was thin, and he'd been walking it for 7 years with no company but the hum and the dark, and the stubborn, inarticulate conviction that the rock was trying to tell him something. But the rock was telling him something. It was telling him his name. He took his hands off the rim. He wiped his face with the back of his glove. He stood in the chamber and breathed and let the hum hold him and thought about what to do next. The professional thing, the responsible thing, the thing a proper scientist or diplomat or heritage custodian would do, was to leave. Climb back up the passage, exit through the gate, report to the Tessarine site coordinators, file a discovery claim with the Heritage Oversight Bureau, and submit himself to whatever legal and institutional process would follow. He had already accumulated enough access violations to guarantee prosecution. Adding a formal discovery report would not make his legal situation worse, and it would make the scientific situation better. The library needed to be documented, studied, understood. It needed linguists and archaeologists and resonance engineers, and the kind of institutional infrastructure that turned raw discovery into knowledge. He knew all of that. He was not a fool. He was a man who had spent 31 years underground, and underground you learned that the most important thing about a discovery was not what you found, it was what you did with the finding. Caves didn't care about your intentions. They cared about your decisions. And the first decision at every new discovery was the same: document, report, and do not proceed beyond what the environment tells you is safe. The environment was telling him something different. The hum had changed again. The words "first voice of the living stone" still resonated in the chamber's air, still pulsed through the script on the walls, still hummed through the rim of the well. But beneath them, a new layer had emerged. A request. Not a command, not a compulsion. An invitation, extended with the same patient certainty that had characterized the gate's 61,000-year vigil. Descend. The library was asking him to go deeper. Tobin looked at the well. He looked at the passage behind him, still lit, still open. He thought about the surface, the monitoring stations, the heritage enforcement perimeter, the Tessarine scholars who had spent a decade studying a sealed gate and would now have to reckon with the fact that it had opened for a man whose primary qualification was an ability to remain calm in tight spaces. He thought about the hum, 7 years of it, 3 years of following it down, a lifetime of underground work that had, without his knowledge or consent, been preparing him for this, training his body to listen through stone, teaching his hands to read vibration, building in him the specific combination of patience and stubbornness, and comfort with darkness that the library's builders had specified as the entry requirement for their 61,000-year waiting room. He was not the smartest person who had ever approached this site. He was not the most qualified, the most connected, the most institutionally supported. He was the one who had listened. He was the one who had followed the sound into the dark when everyone else, the scholars, the engineers, the custodians, The ex-wife had told him to stop. He was, in the most literal sense available, a man who had crawled through a hole in rock, because the rock had asked him to, and had kept crawling until the rock said his name. First voice. He looked at the well one more time. Then he sat down on the chamber floor, his back against the platform, his hands resting on his knees. He did not descend. Not yet. Not today. The library had waited 61,000 years. It could wait a few hours more while he sat with what he'd been told and let the weight of it settle. He would go back up. He would report what he'd found. He would face the tribunal, the heritage violations, the suspended license, the legal consequences of a dozen unauthorized descents. He would stand in a room full of people who had spent their careers studying this site from a distance and tell them that the site had reached back, and that it had reached for him, and that the gate was open and the library was awake and the first lesson was waiting at the bottom of a well. They would not believe him, not at first. The Tessarines would demand verification. The Heritage Bureau would demand protocols. The Keithrani custodians would demand to know why their 61,000-year vigil had ended for a man with chalk on his gloves and no academic standing. And then someone would go down. Someone would press their hands against the stone and hear nothing, no hum, no match, no heartbeat recognition, and they would understand. The stone was specific. The stone was patient. The stone had chosen. Tobin sat in the chamber and breathed and let the hum hold him and knew, with the quiet, bone-deep certainty of a man who had spent his whole life reading rock, that this was only the beginning. The gate was open, the library was awake, and the first voice of the living stone had work to do. He would go back up. He would tell them what the gate had said. He would come back down. The hum was still there when he started climbing, steady, matched, unwavering. It followed him through the passage and through the gate and up the shaft, fading slowly, reluctantly, the way a conversation fades when one speaker walks toward the door but neither of them has said goodbye. At the surface, the dawn light of Dren Vorath's long day was breaking over the basalt shelf. The monitoring stations blinked their steady green. The heritage enforcement perimeter hummed with its own lesser frequencies. Tobin stood in the cold air and looked at the sky, vast, alien, filled with the pale disk of Paulith Major rising over the horizon, and pressed his chalk-dusted palm against the nearest rock face one last time. The stone was warm. It would always be warm now. The gate was open. The library was awake. The 61,000-year vigil was over, and in its place was something new, a conversation between a world built of patient stone and a man who had learned to listen to it, one handhold at a time, one descent at a time, one heartbeat at a time, all the way down. First voice. That was who he was. That was who the stone had named him. Not a king, not an heir, not a maker or a founder. A voice. The one who speaks for the silent record. The one whose body the library was tuned to hear. Tobin Vasek, spelunker, guild certification suspended, marriage dissolved, savings exhausted, reputation ruined. The first human the living stone had ever spoken to. The first voice it had ever heard. He pressed his palm against the rock and felt the hum answer, and it was enough.